Hello, welcome to our virtual Hill Day prep webinar. Thank you so much for being here. I know some folks will be joining as we go, but being mindful of everyone's time, I want to make sure we get started as close to on time as we can. I'm going to try to be keeping an eye on people in the waiting room, so hopefully I don't get too distracted. So I think everybody knows, but the mission at the National Network for Youth is to transform systems so that no young person in America experiences homelessness. We do this by focusing on public education and policy advocacy, partnering with young people who've experienced homelessness through our National Youth Advisory Council, and providing training and technical assistance. Today, our agenda is first we're going to cover virtual advocacy, some main differences and some pro tips, go through the congressional asks for the Hill Day. We may not do breakouts by state just because there aren't a ton of people from each state, but we'll play that by ear just to see who we have in the room. We might still do it for a little bit, and then we'll have Q&A, and I think we might do Q&A before breakouts and after breakouts. So that's the plan. So let's dig in. So we have a couple of new resources that should provide great content for you all for our upcoming virtual Hill Day. The one new resource is a virtual advocacy toolkit. It's really a how-to guide of advocating in the virtual world. Virtual advocacy isn't going to be going away. It very much is going to continue even in the post-vaccine world. There will be a lot of increased opportunities to advocate from the comfort of your home or your office. So this really covers kind of how to schedule a meeting, what's different, effective tips on virtual advocacy, both for meetings, for site visits, doing virtual site visits, roundtable discussions, all of that. We did do a short video that covered the highlights focusing on congressional meetings. So if you haven't watched it, I encourage you to watch it, because that video does cover some things that we're not going to go over on the webinar today. Also, we did release our presidential agenda for solving youth and young adult homelessness in America. It has all of our policy priorities really for at least the next 2 years, maybe 4. It's broken down by federal agency, but it also does include some legislative priorities. I also did a video on the release of that publication as well. And we'll make sure you have these slides. These slides will be available to you on our website. And then we can also, maybe Carrie can share it in chat so you guys have it. So starting off with some inspiration. You are powerful. Your lived experiences and your expertise can help shape the policies that are created. I mean, I think the biggest example we have of that is the $800 million that passed the Senate on Saturday through the U.S. Department of Education that's explicitly targeted to children and youth experiencing homelessness. There's also a new earned income tax credit for childless, homeless, and foster youth starting at the age of 18. So there is power in advocacy, and we have some like very recent examples of the power of advocacy. So please know that these meetings have an impact. So we're going to just dive into, okay, this is the wrong slide, sorry. So effective advocacy and engagement. So how can you be an effective advocate? You want to engage the heart of the policymaker. So share a story, connect. Where is there a shared experience? Did you both go to the same school? Some type of shared heart connection. Influence the mind, provide practical information. How can you make it relatable to the policymaker, right? And then you need to get them to consider their political health. What is the cost to society? What could the cost to their political career for not helping young people experiencing homelessness, right? Like, what are the benefits to their the political life? So you really want to try to check all 3 of those boxes in all of your meetings with policymakers and think, how are we engaging their heart? how are we influencing their mind, and how are we making the connection to their political health, whether collectively as a society or personally for them. So virtual advocacy, what's new? We get lots of questions. How does this work? We're so used to meeting in person. We're so used to going to the Heart Center and having our meeting face to face. The good news is you can influence policy from anywhere now. COVID has shifted many, many things, and how you advocate is definitely one of them. I've been doing Hill meetings all throughout, since everything changed a year ago. And these are some tips that I've learned. A lot of my Hill meetings are phone calls. They're not videos like this where we're seeing most of your faces. Some policymakers, they shock you and it's a video and you're like, oh, I wasn't expecting a video. Most of my meetings are a conference call. So it really just depends on the legislator. Take their lead, right? What is their comfort level? What is their policies? Some offices have certain policies because they're worried about hackers. They have all of these concerns around privacy. And so every policy kind of has their individual policies around what their privacy policies are, how they'll engage with constituents and advocates. And so that's what people have to follow. It's not really up to me or an advocate, whether it's a video or a phone call. And I've been on meetings recently where it's 3 advocates on a Zoom and we're showing our face and both Hill staffers are on the phone. They won't show their face. And it'll just be their initials. So you couldn't necessarily tie it back to them, that Senate office. It's just their policies. So I think be prepared. Also, these virtual meetings are less likely to include a member of Congress. Like I think most of you who've done Hill meetings in the past, you're maybe meeting with a legislative director and you're like, hey, is the senator available for a picture, right? It's a little more awkward to do that in these settings because they're usually in different locations, right? Like I talk to Hill staffers in Hawaii, or they're all over the place, right? They're not necessarily in DC. They're not necessarily down the hall from their boss, right? So that's a little bit different as well. So unless you've scheduled a meeting directly with a member of Congress, I think you can just expect a staffer to be on. And at best, it'll just be voice. But you can always ask, right? You can always say in your email, hey, is there any way Senator so-and-so can join our meeting for a little bit? We'd like to say hi. And if it is on video, you can take a screenshot, share it on social media, right? So I think there's no harm in asking. The congressional staff will always kind of let you know what's possible. So here are some tips in general. Make sure you prepare talking points and you assign roles. So everybody from your state that's going to be in the meeting, make sure they're clear on what their role is, have an agenda. We have found that these virtual meetings are shorter. There's not a lot of time for like chit chat and like coffee talk, right? It's just a little bit more to the point, than an in-person meeting, which is kind of the downside of virtual advocacy versus in person. So, I've had meetings on some bills where I was asking for them to change some language and it was like 5 minutes. But they included my language recommendations. I was like, well, we didn't really need to talk for an hour for them to do what I wanted. They did it in 5 minutes. So it's not necessarily, a shorter meeting doesn't necessarily mean it's bad or it's less impactful. I think it's how you use those 15 minutes and what your follow-up is and your continual engagement, right? Because again, it goes back to building long-term deep relationships over time and to some extent holding them accountable, right? So plan for 15 minutes, your kind of draft agenda that you do with talking points. Make sure you get all the most important information out in the first 15 minutes. Make sure the ask is out, you're engaging their heart, you've shared a story, you've given some statistics, whether it's just state or local or national, whatever you have. But then be prepared for it to go longer. Just keep on talking. You know, if you can get the minute to, you know, if it's a 30-minute meeting, that's great. And then hopefully they have questions. You know, an engaged staffer or who asks questions is really the dream. I mean, unless they're an expert, right, on the bills you're talking about or the issue you're talking about, which they're not, right, because they're just not. So if you know, 30 minutes, some meetings maybe an hour. You know, I know some of our Senate folks have blocked off an hour and they've sent a calendar invite for an hour, which like doesn't usually happen. But I think if they're anticipating, you know, 20 people from their state, then they're going to block off an hour, right? And so I think that again, you play it by ear. Depends on who you're meeting with, how many folks in your group, all of that. Definitely try to make sure you have a good internet connection. I think it's always best to turn off your video if that means you're going to have a stronger connection than to show your face, because you don't want to waste time with, you know, internet issues. And then definitely take notes. I know in the moment you can get excited and you're like, oh, they asked me a question that I didn't have an answer to, and I told them I would follow up in an email, which is no problem, right? Like you don't need to know the answers to all of their questions. And sometimes they'll ask you kind of off the wall questions that are quite off topic or just like you wouldn't necessarily know the answer to. So it's always fine to say, you know, I don't have the answer right now, but I'll get back to you with that. You know, that's part of building the relationship as like a trusted expert to that Hill staff, right? So definitely try to take notes or assign a note taker, and hopefully your notes make more sense after meetings than some of mine. Sometimes I'd be like, what was I writing down? And always, this is my like pet peeve as an advocate, every meeting has to have an ask. You know, you don't ever want to have a meeting with a policymaker just to say you've had a meeting, you talked about your program, you've talked about all the issues, but you have to actually have an ask or a solution. Trust me, who you're meeting with wants to know what you want them to do. You're a constituent. Their job is to serve you as a constituent. And so, yes, talk about the issues, talk about your program, have young people share their experiences and give their perspective, but make sure you're asking them to do at least one thing. We have multiple things always for policymakers to do because we have a very robust policy agenda. And make sure you get that ask in the first 15 minutes in case they are abruptly, you know, ending the meeting. Some people, you know, have it in their opening, you know, they do introductions and then say, hey, we really want to talk to you about the Runaway and Homeless Youth Trafficking Prevention Act, the Emergency Family Stabilization Act, and some key funding asks for FY22 appropriations, right? So those are your three asks. And then however you have the agenda laid out, they will have gotten fact sheets in an email before the meeting. You're going to follow up after the meeting with the fact sheets again, because repetition is effective. And so they'll have the asks, right? So these are the big asks for FY21. Our asks have not changed as a result of the American Rescue Act, which is set to pass the House tomorrow and then be signed into law. So we're still 100% pushing the Emergency Family Stabilization Act. And this is just an overview of the ask. I'm going to go into it more in depth. The ask there is co-sponsorship. In the Senate, the bill's already introduced. In the House, co-sponsor it after it is introduced, which hopefully will be this month. Also, Runaway and Homeless Youth Trafficking Prevention Act, also hoping it's introduced this month. Probably won't be till next month. Folks have been a little bit busy. But co-sponsor it after introduction. If you're meeting with a chair of committee that has jurisdiction over the Runaway and Homeless Youth Trafficking Prevention Act, then the ask there is to make it a priority of the committee. And I have a slide on what the committees are and the members later. And then for FY22 funding, we have like a 6-page fact sheet with clear number asks, but also appropriations language requests, which is report language. Basically, it's a way you can kind of change law for that fiscal year. And it's been a very effective tool for us, particularly with HUD, and then a little bit with Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. And again, all of that is in the fact sheet. You don't need to memorize any of that. We have explanations and kind of justifications for all of our asks right there. So what's written in the fact sheets should answer most of the questions as to why we're asking for, the funding we are, or why we're asking for the report language we are. And if you're a service provider, I think you'll be able to, make the connection from a provider perspective. We're asking for $300 million for the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act. We're also asking for money for YHDP and HUD Homelessness Assistance Grant Program. It didn't fit on my slide, but it's in the fact sheets and it's in the slides coming later. Also, the other ask is around the low-income housing tax credit student rule fix. You can't live in LIHTC funded housing now and be a full-time student. The 5-minute meeting I had was to improve language in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act so that you can be a full-time student if you were homeless and live in LIHTC funded housing. So it would fix that student rule issue for homeless and foster youth. So the bill should be introduced this month. It might not be till next month, but the language that's in it is good. And so the ask there is to co-sponsor that bill after it's introduced. Our understanding is that it's a priority of the chair of the committee to move this congressional session. Okay, so the current context for federal policy. Most folks know this, but just from a high level, Democrats are in control of the House, Senate, and the executive branch. The Senate has a very narrow majority, so a bipartisan approach is especially important. So we can't ignore the Republicans, even with the Dems in control, because we have moderates on both sides of the aisle. Ongoing focus, there's a combination of policy approaches to address. So budget reconciliation with COVID relief, that should be final this week. We're expecting an additional COVID relief / economic stimulus, build back better type of bill that's less focused on temporary and emergency and more focused on longer term permanent, infrastructure, employment issues is what we're hearing. And then also FY22 appropriations, which is currently delayed because the OMB chair got derailed. And so anyhow, if you've been following politics. So the Emergency Family Stabilization Act, I'm just going to go through each of our asks. So it would create a new emergency fund at the Administration on Children and Families. The House bill is going to have $2 billion in it once it's introduced. The Senate bill that's already introduced has $800 million in it. You're eligible if you have expertise in serving homeless children, youth, or families. There is a set aside for existing Administration on Children and Families applicants, which if you have Runaway and Homeless Youth Act monies, you are. But there is also an amount where you don't have to be an existing ACF grantee. As long as you have expertise, you can apply. It's very flexible, wide array of funding that it could be used for: housing, health, education, safety-related needs. There is special considerations given to pregnant women, pregnant and parenting youth, children under 6, children with disabilities, families experiencing domestic violence, survivors of sexual assault or human trafficking, LGBTQ or racial and ethnic minority populations. So right now, we have a Senate bill. These are our current co-sponsors. So they're listed there on the left. So if you're meeting with any of these senators, don't ask them to co-sponsor the bill because they already did. Ask them to include it in the next package that Congress is moving. The issue that we've come up upon is we don't have close connections to Schumer or Pelosi, and so we haven't been able to get this included in a base bill. And so all we've been able to do is the amendment for the $800 million through ED, because we took money that they already had for ours, for our education amendment. There was no ACF money to take from for this program using an amendment strategy, right? So ideally, you get language in a base bill.
Could
Paul,
you
do you have a
go over that
question?
again? Darla, this is Paul. Could you just
Sure.
where this is? So the 800 million. This is not the 800 million that we just celebrated Saturday,
No. Right.
right?
No.
Okay.
The 800 million Saturday, which we're going to do a webinar with Schoolhouse Connection about what's in the American Rescue Plan next
Yeah.
week.
Okay.
But that's through the U.S. Department of Education, because that's all we could do. So obviously, it's the same champions that did that amendment. It's Manchin and Murkowski, the same champions of the Emergency Family Stabilization Act. But they didn't get, we don't have strong champions on the Emergency Family Stabilization Act in the House. And budget resolution originates in the House. So this wasn't in the base bill, the American Rescue Plan, right? So, but what was $219 billion to education, and none of it earmarked towards children and youth experiencing homelessness. Mm-hmm. So our only play really was to offer a Senate amendment to take 800 million of that 219 billion to be directed towards identifying and serving children and youth experiencing homelessness and wraparound services. So the hope is that in implementation, that some of that wraparound services money will go to community-based organizations, right? Not just local education or state education agencies. Of course, we want them to get the money too, right? We're not, trying to take all of the money. But in the American Rescue Act, there wasn't like billions and billions of dollars at ACF where we could have offered an amendment to take ACF money for the to implement the Emergency Family Stabilization Act. It's 800 million because that's the amount that Murkowski was comfortable with. And it's very fascinating that we had 5 Republicans on that Senate amendment, none of whom who voted for the overall bill. They all voted against the bill, but they all voted for the amendment, right? So anyhow, I don't want to get too politically nerdy, but they did what they could to influence the bill that they ultimately didn't end up voting for. And for that, we're grateful, right? Because nobody else was really willing to do it. So does that make sense now? So we're not giving up on the Emergency Family Stabilization Act because for us, we need to have a comprehensive approach. HUD needs to be directing money to our young people, Department of Labor, HHS, Ed, right? Everybody has their part to do, right? And so this was just an influx to Ed, but we're still looking at and targeting other agencies. So these are just some talking points. I don't want to necessarily go over them now because you guys will have the PowerPoint later. But these talking points are really just to help you prepare, right? And to feel comfortable talking about the Emergency Family Stabilization Act if you're meeting with a member of Congress where the ask is co-sponsorship, right? So now just being mindful of time. So Runaway and Homeless Youth Trafficking Prevention Act, it will hopefully be reintroduced soon. I had a check-in call with our champions last week. We're just waiting for bill text. So it's the same champions in the Senate and the House. They're still very committed. We are adding a new optional prevention program, prevention services program, which would be an additional, it's either 50 or 75,000 a year. If you get basic center, transitional living program, or maternity group home, when you apply, you would have the option of applying to also provide prevention services to prevent homelessness among youth and young adults. And so it does add a very broad definition of prevention services. And so you would apply for $225,000 a year because that's the new award amount in the law. And you could apply for an additional optional $75,000 on top of that. So you could get a total of $300,000 a year for your basic center program plus prevention services program grant. At least that's how I wrote it. We'll see what Ledge Council gives back. I always, track change the law and then Ledge Council does their thing, but I think it should be pretty close. All grants would be 5 years, staggered every 2 to 3 years. Geographic distribution considered when giving grants. All the same stuff around training staff on human trafficking, trauma, sexual abuse, assault. The non-discrimination clause is the same. And so this is the funding. This is a big change so the overall, your award would go up to $225,000 a year. Right now it's $200,000. If we get it appropriated or funded at more than $200 million a year, then that $225,000 goes up to $250,000. So it's kind of a trigger that we've written into the law. And the overall authorized amount would go up to $300 million. Right now we're at $152 million. So kind of doubling basically what the authorizers of the law are recommending to the appropriators, which are two different processes. Getting the law passed and getting it funded are two different things. So this would just be recommending in law that the appropriators give it $300 million. It would still require the appropriators to give it $300 million, but obviously it helps strengthen the case. So these are some key talking points. You know, there's 4.2 million young people who experience homelessness every year. These are vital community-based programs that have youth-centric services and housing. This bill makes key programmatic updates that we need so we can improve our services for young people, right? So it includes provisions to combat trafficking, which is very, you know, combating human trafficking is a bipartisan issue for the most part. It would prohibit discrimination. It increases the amount of time I can serve young people from 21 to 30 days in basic center programs. It increases the amount of money I would get. It would increase the overall amount the program would get. It would increase the age for transitional living programs. So really frame it as, I need these updates in law so I can do a better job serving young people, right? And like, these changes are urgent. Like, that's, I can say like providers need this, but you can say it as a provider in first person and as a constituent, which is way more powerful than me. So current status, waiting for introduction. These are the asks. Senate Judiciary Committee has jurisdiction. And then in the Senate and in the House, it's the Education and Labor Committee. So if you're meeting with someone who's a member of those committee, you need to say, hey, this bill goes through your committee. You need to make it a priority. You need to move this bill this session. And if they're not on the committee, then it's co-sponsorship, right? I mean, you want them to co-sponsor on the committee too. And then here's the committees, just so you can look. So I put on here, so this is Senate Judiciary Committee. We had a change in leadership. So Senator Durbin from Illinois is the chair. I know that our friends from Illinois have all the meetings with Judiciary Committee staffer, Ledge Council, like 5 people in Durbin's office. But if you're meeting with any other members of the committee, please raise that as a priority. And again, you'll have this PowerPoint slide afterwards. And this is like these House committee memberships are like way bigger. But Bobby Scott from Virginia is the chair. I don't think anybody's meeting with Virginia Fox from North Carolina, but if you are, don't even bother. She will never make this a priority. She will never vote for it, ever, ever, ever. She doesn't believe in federal funding. So if you meet with her, God bless you, and tell me the story after. She will never support federal funding, period. Ever. So FY22 asks, so the president's budget is delayed because the OMB director that had been nominated got derailed and won't pass. So they're looking for a new OMB director. So we're no longer kind of waiting for the president's budget anymore, but none of the appropriations committees have kind of said that, because usually it's the president's budget that kicks things off, especially when the administration is in the same political party as those who control the Congress, right? But it's still too early for Dear Colleagues. I don't anticipate we're going to be circling a Dear Colleague ask until April. And a Dear Colleague is like members of Congress write letters to the appropriators. So like their fellow members of Congress, but on the Appropriations Committee, and say, hey, we really think you need to increase funding for these programs. So we do a Runaway and Homeless Youth Act and Education for Homeless Children and Youth joint letter, because that's the same subcommittee. HUD is a different subcommittee, and we don't have capacity to do 2 different subcommittees for Dear Colleague letters. And we work with Schoolhouse Connection on the Dear Colleague letters. So we have 4 funding asks and report language asks. I would focus talking points on COVID impacts, right? Like we need more money, impact of COVID. We're seeing more young people that need services. We're seeing more severe needs, mental health needs, whatever's true for you. But I definitely think appropriators are looking for kind of the COVID talking points there and increase in need numbers. We didn't have we weren't meeting the need pre-COVID, and now it's even worse, right? Like making the connection. So like I said before, 300 million for Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, because that's what's going to be in the bill that's introduced. So you always want to ask the authorizers and the appropriators for the same thing. We're asking for 300 million in the base bill. We're asking for 300 million in funding, right? And continue the previous report language, but add new, allow RHYA providers to serve systems involved youth, allow RHYA providers to serve youth funded by other sources within the same program. There's been some issues around that. 300 million for the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program. Talking points, public schools identified 1.5 million homeless children in the 17-18 school year, 11% increase over the previous year. Yet only 1 in 4 school districts actually receive any money from the Education for Homeless Children and Youth. So it's largely an unfunded mandate, right, of public schools. So we're asking for 100 million for another round of HUD youth homeless demonstration programs. We have a lot of additional report language recommendations. Highlights I put here: require youth homeless demonstration projects, youth advisory boards, and Runaway and Homeless Youth Act providers to approve of the plan. Right now, the COC holds all the power. Require that 3% of YHDP budgets are paying for youth advisory boards creation and maintenance. So there's actually money from HUD going to fund the work of creating and maintaining youth advisory boards, and require that all categories of HUD homelessness be served. So all the different categories without needing to apply for a waiver. And then we're asking for 3.3 billion from McKinney-Vento HUD homelessness assistance grants. That's what the National Alliance is asking for. Plus, we're asking for additional report language to remove additional eligibility criteria that's added for permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, require youth-funded projects to have separate outcome measures, not additional outcome measures, separate. That was a very clear conversation we had. And explicit report language that prohibits discrimination. There's no protection in the HERTH Act against discrimination in regulation or in NOFA. So let's put it in report language. So these are the appropriations subcommittee members. So like I said, there's actually 2 different subcommittees that we work in meetings, only one that we do a Dear Colleague for. So Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, it's the Senate Labor, Health, and Human Services, Education, and Related Agencies Subcommittee within the overall Appropriations Committee. So in the Senate, who's in charge is Senator Murray in Washington. And then Blunt is ranking in Missouri. And then in the House, DeLauro from Connecticut is chair of Labor HHS subcommittee. Cole from Oklahoma is ranking, and then all of the other members there. So these are obviously the members of Congress that have the most power over funding for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program. And in a dream world, we have like a champion for our funding ask in both the Senate and the House. And so for HUD, so HUD funding goes through Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, called THUD subcommittee for short. So we have a leadership change here. So Schatz from Hawaii is now the chair. Previously, when the Democrats had control, it was Reed from Rhode Island. And Collins is now ranking instead of chair, since Republicans are in the minority. And you can see all the other members here. And then in the House, Price from North Carolina is chair. And again, this is a change. And then we have Diaz-Balart from Florida. And Quigley from Illinois is like a co-chair. I don't know. It's kind of like a sub-chair. I've never seen that before, but Quigley has a leadership role, kind of below Price. So that's kind of interesting. So this is just an overview of our legislative priorities. So we talked about the Runaway and Homeless Youth Trafficking Prevention Act, Emergency Family Stabilization Act, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Fix, also the Homeless Children and Youth Act, that would align federal definitions. Not sure when that's going to be introduced. And also the Higher Education Access and Success for Homeless and Foster Youth Act. I don't know when that's going to be introduced either. Both of those last two bills might be more towards the summer, just because there's a lot of other stuff going on right now. With the new administration, if folks don't know who their state captains are, they are here. You can connect with them. And again, I will share this slide. Become a member if you're not. Thank you, Carrie, for this beautiful slide. And now we'll do questions, and then if folks want to do breakouts, we can. But I don't know that we have enough folks by state to do breakouts, to be honest. But feel free to unmute yourself, or I'm going to find the chat box, which I'm terrible at looking at when I'm presenting, but feel free to just talk. Paul.
Yeah. I'll ask one more. It's just Paul again from Lighthouse. So I was following you quite well with the legislative priorities, and we talked about RHYTPA, the EFSA, and the LIDIC rule. Then when we shifted into the appropriations, I was, and part of my job, I think, is to ask this stupid questions. So everybody else on the call, hopefully there's somebody else going, oh, I'm really glad I asked that. What the appropriations part, I got a little bit lost, because I'm like, okay, what am I asking? That's not a specific piece of legislation. That's existing legislation that is now we're asking for re-upping or increasing of these. Can you just talk that through quickly again?
Yeah. So the appropriations process is like its own special thing. And it's like every year it has to happen. But how it happens varies, right? So like last year, we had a continuing resolution. Like they just said, copy and paste the FY20 budget on the FY21. They're like, we're just going to delete 2020, put in 2021, and there's our spending bill, right? Like, but we're not expecting a continuing resolution this year because we have a new administration with the new funding priorities, right? And Biden's been coming out pretty strong, right? And delivering on campaign promises. So what we were expecting is a president's budget, and then we meet with the appropriations committee and it's like, hey, I know you're working on your bills. This is what Biden asked for. We need more than that, right? Because we don't anticipate that the president's budget is going to have $300 million for runaway and homeless youth, right? We need more, and this is why, right? 4.2 million young people, pandemic, all the things, right? And so you kind of want to pre-influence appropriators before they're writing the bill, because there's the president's budget, and then there's this, what they call 302B allocations. So the budget committee figures out the overall spending number, like how much are we spending for the fiscal year? And then the chairs of the appropriations committee give each subcommittee an allocation of how much money they have to spend total for all their federal programs, right? And so for us in labor HHS, runaway and homeless youth is always at a disadvantage because HHS is a massive federal agency. HUD is tiny. HUD is like one department of HHS. Like all of HUD is like one department of HHS. So for us, there's so many layers of competition. And so the labor HHS gets their 302P allocations. Then they allocate that to federal agency. And then within HHS, ACF is competing with SAMHSA, the CDC. Like it's a massive agency, right? And then ACF gets their amounts, and then we're competing with child welfare, child development, child care development block grant, Head Start. And we don't like to say we're competing, right? Because we never say offsets. We never want to say take money from foster care and give it to us. Like, that's not how we are as advocates, right? But maybe I'd be okay with that. We do a better job. Anyhow, so it's very competitive. And we're like this small, program. So it's a bigger thing. So we've gotten kind of more successes and money at HUD because it's way less competitive, smaller agency. The subcommittee is completely different than Labor HHS. I hope that makes sense. So what we're trying to do is pre-influence the writing of the appropriations bills. And really what we're trying to find is like some people we can like pull their heartstrings about youth homelessness that has power on Labor HHS and THUD. Because I think the spending originates in the House, right? And so the challenge for us has always been we have more friends in the Senate, right? But all the money bills originate in the House. Good. And our closest friend in the House is Chair of Budget, and he's been the one that's done the most in terms of increasing funding for our programs, Chairman John Yarmouth. So does that help a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So the current RHYA budget, the last, I think we got 113 million. 114 million, yeah, something like that. And I can double check and let you know. Yeah, so like next month, I'll be sending an e-blast saying, tell your senator or tell your member of Congress to sign on to our Dear Colleague letter. And that's the letter that we write with our champions to the Appropriations Committee from senators and members of the House asking for increased funding for the Runaway and Homeless Youth and McKinney-Vento Education Act. And those letters have a big impact, more of an impact than like organizational sign-ons, not that you don't have power, but when members of Congress are writing letters to their fellow members of Congress with a request, that gets taken into account, right, when funding allocations are made. So we're always trying to get, as many senators onto Dear Colleague letters and as many House folks. And it's hard for us to get folks signed on because we're not constituents and there's a lot of requests flying at the same time, right? So that's why we always are like, contact your members of Congress, help. Any other questions?
Darla, it's Shauna. I think, could you clarify again if our members are not on these lists that you have been showing? I think you said that the ask is co-sponsor when it comes out, co-sponsor when it comes out. Is there something up? Okay.
Yeah. So in the Senate, the like co-sponsor now is Emergency Family Stabilization Act, which none of your folks from Colorado are on.
Yes, right.
Even though they should be, and I've emailed them, but but I'm not a constituent.
Right.
And then for the other ones, it's co-sponsor after. Yeah.
Okay.
And then, the other thing, if you're really trying to be an all-star advocate, if we're talking about appropriations, if you're really wanting to get into the nitty-gritty, which obviously I'm a very passionate policy person, but every member of Congress also submits to the Appropriations Committee, no matter what committee they sit on, they submit their top 3 appropriations requests. And this is like, advocates know this, right? So to be an all-star advocate, you can be like Senator Gardner. In your request for FY22 appropriations to the committee, in your personal requests, because that's what they're called, I'd like you to include $300 million for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act in your top 3 personal requests. Because every office has their top 3 personal appropriations requests that they submit. For us, the only member of Congress that I know, RHYA, is in their top 3 is Chairman John Yarmouth. And I know that our increased RHYA funding is in one of his top 3 requests, because his staffer forwards me the email, so I have proof. But, you know, like Ed, in your meeting, one of your top 3 requests should be $300 million for the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth program, right? So I hope that makes sense. Like, that's kind of a, I don't want to get too wonky, but that's another ask you can make that has a really big impact on FY funding. I mean, and once you get a couple of members of Congress that have the same personal request, then you're really seeing an increase in funding.
Carla, could we talk about coordination? I guess as state captains, are we supposed to be working with those from our state that are attending the summit?
Yes, and I think from your state, it's basically everyone from your organization, plus I think some university folks.
Yeah.
So have you emailed them yet, Ed?
I have not, no. I was waiting till
Yeah, no, it's fine. So I think I sent you all a draft email to send. If I did not, please let me know. Ed, did I not send you an email?
I don't recall seeing that, sorry.
Oh, okay. No, I'm going to make a note. I probably didn't. So if you're a state captain and I have not sent you an email with a draft email for you to send to everybody from your state and a list of contact information from everybody registered from your state, please let me know. Also, we've had like 40 more people register in the past couple of days. So I know, Shauna, I've been emailing you a lot of updates. A lot of folks from Colorado keep registering. So you may get like additional emails like, hey, Bonita, we have 2 new people from Ohio, Ed, 3 new people from Maryland. But the goal is that you email everyone and see if they're participating. Not everybody is. Like, I know a lot of the McKinney-Vento homeless liaisons can't participate, but I want them to have the option, right? Like, I don't want to opt anybody out. So rather just cast a wide net. And so if people are saying, yes, I'm participating, then please include them, in a planning meeting where you kind of go through, and we put together a draft agenda in a Word doc that you can use to just kind of, you can completely erase it and do your own agenda. Like, it's not a requirement, but just as a starting point to the extent that it's helpful. And all of that is linked on our, let me share our Hill Day page. We actually did a state captain and a Hill Day page, and all of our fact sheets are hyperlinked there. You can download them as PDFs. Let me put the link in here for folks, and we'll keep updating it. And I'll be sending kind of another state captain email like, hey, is there anything you need from me? Because some folks need help with staff contacts or whatever. I have access to Politico Pro, so I can pull like all the staffer contacts from any member of Congress and give it to you in an Excel sheet. So whatever makes it easiest for you.
And then what about sending or setting the appointments with the elected officials?
I'm sorry, what?
What about setting the appointments with
yes,
senators?
That is, it's your job to set the meetings with the senators, but other folks in the state set their own House meetings. If you need staffer contacts for your senators, or like and I think I have a draft email for you to send, I can get you staff contacts for your senators in Maryland.
Okay.
Carla, we have a question here from Karen. It says, why can't McKinney-Vento liaisons participate?
Oh, no, they can. Some can, but some school districts have policies where it's considered like lobbying, and so they're like prohibited. It's hit or miss. Some liaisons can and some can't. Some school district folks can and some can't. But we Yeah, I know RHY providers and other providers don't have that limitation. And I know that some liaisons will like go to meetings as like a private citizen, right? They're not introducing themselves as a homeless liaison, working for whatever school district. Anyhow, I think there's just different policies depending on the school district and maybe even the state. Here, and I just found the link to our virtual Hill Day. And then on this page, there's a state captain at the bottom. You can click on another. Thank you, Carrie. Are there other questions I'm missing? Can't even find the chat box now. Where is it? Okay, here we go. Oh, Carrie already put it on there. Of course, Carrie did.
There is one question, but I think you already got it. What is the current RHYA budget?
Yeah, I think it was 114 was the last funded amount. You could also say, if you want, it did get money in the CARES Act for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program to help providers meet the need, but that money is gone and it wasn't flexible enough. I think anything to help elevate the value of a program, right? The fact that the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act was even included in the COVID relief package was a pretty huge win. And it does kind of elevate like its stature, if you will, to policymakers. What other questions? All right, and I'm going to check my email for Ed. And honestly, if there's anything I can do to help assist with your virtual Hill Day, please let me know. And I think that's it.
I just have a quick question.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So I've sent an email out to everyone who's signed up for New York so far.
Uh-huh.
And I'll send out another one to set up our meeting.
Mm-hmm.
How persistent do we need to be with those folks? Because at some point with the senator, I've set up the senator meetings, but I need to send them emails and names and descriptions of folks. So
yeah,
what kind of a timeline or how annoying should we be as captains around that?
Well, it is very hard to get a response to an email these days. I mean, I think folks are just kind of like tapped out. So I would say be persistent. Okay. And like maybe to the point where like Senator Schumer needs a list, right? Or like,
okay. I think I'm getting like, a glimpse of your world, Darla. I don't know.
Oh my gosh. It's like, I feel like so obnoxious, but it's like, I'm trying to change policy here and they can't wait for you. Like the Senate is voting. OMG. Like, so, yeah, I think it's annoying. I mean, we really struggle, Carrie and I, around that because we're like, we know people are busy, but we're trying to get you millions of dollars. Can you help us?
And do you think can we encourage the folks from our state to also bring consumers into the meeting?
Oh, yes, definitely. And they don't have to be registered for the summit, right? If they have, we have quite a few young people registered, but like, don't make them, your young person needs to register for the summit to participate in virtual Hill. No, that is not the case. Okay. Yeah. And I think having a good showing, kind of checking all the buckets of heart, mind, political health, and is most important because we're really trying to, impact policy here, right? And young people should be at the center of that. And we certainly don't want to require summit registration for that. That would be very against our values.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Just a pragmatic one, if you don't mind. Does in our case, the senators, do they set up the Zoom sessions or do we make ours available to them? How's that all work? Just from a coordination?
So it varies, right? So some offices will only use theirs and they use like Skype and it's only like conference call, right? Like, Senator Feinstein staffers set up a Zoom in 5 minutes and like blocked off an hour, right, for all the California constituents. Probably because I think he's used to like 30 people from California, right? So it kind of varies.
Okay.
I'm like, hey, do you want me to set up, do you want me to set up a conference call? But other staffers will just kind of do it automatically, and they'll just send you a calendar invite.
Okay.
So they'll be fine using yours, and maybe they'll just be on phone and won't show their face, but that's fine.
Okay.
But I think I do picture them staring at our faces, though. So I'm like, any other questions? Thank you guys so much for joining today. And Carrie, I think this is recorded, maybe?
Yes, this is being recorded. So tomorrow I am going to just edit out the beginning part and send it out to the group along with the slides.
And will they be also on our Hill Day page, maybe?
Yep, we'll also add it to the website.
Yeah, so it'll also be on our virtual Hill Day, so you guys can look back at the slides for reference and even share the webinar with anybody you want from your state. Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.